Some painting projects are harder to pull off than others. There's a lot of reasons for this, of course, and you just go through each of the steps and make the decisions as you see fit. But today, I don't get to make any of those decisions. I've got to follow the path of this jackass and what he laid before me. You know, it seems as the 3D sculpting technology has advanced, we've had a wider variety of great miniatures out there to paint, but there's still so many sculptors that like to zoom their model in to 1000% and sculpt 1 million tiny little details.
Enhance. Enhance. Enhance.
And that's led me down the path to really appreciate models that are sculpted elegantly. And I don't mean simplistic models. I mean, they know what to pay attention to. So when my friends Andy and Henry from over at the Cult of Paint YouTube channel sent me over a gorgeous elf from their Deogard 2 Kickstarter, which is live right now, by the way, I knew I would have a blast painting him up. At least I thought this would be a blast until they issued me a challenge, something that I've never done before and never really considered how to approach. You see, this elf is actually a part of a duel scene against what I will assume is some form of bad guy elf, so you can paint the models up individually, or you can combine them to make a pretty epic battle scene. So their challenge was for me to paint this good guy elf, and one notorious Vince Venturella to paint the bad guy elf. Seems straightforward and simple enough, right? Not so fast. You see, if this scene is really going to feel cohesive and that these two models are actually in the same environment when two painters a half a country away painted them, there's a lot more details that are going to go into this decision making. But then I remembered a very important bit of information, and that is, it's not cheating if you don't get caught. So when I visited Vince a month ago, I noticed that he was already done painting his evil elf. So I did what any savvy painter in such a pigment predicament would do. I stole his model. So now my plan is to take his model and look at every single decision that he made in the painting process, whether I agree with it or not, and use that to dictate exactly how I'm going to approach painting my model so they feel cohesive. Vince, you better not have screwed me on this, or you're not getting this back. The first thing I notice in Vince's model is the colors that he chose to paint him in. Very cold colors, a lot of blues and teals and purples, which fit really well for the bad guy aesthetic. So immediately I'm thinking I need to create contrast and drama in this piece through color. So with his cold colors, I will contrast those with a lot of warm colors on my elf. And even in my initial investigation of his paint scheme, which he's made videos on himself on his channel, I'll put a link down to his channel below, I've noticed that there is a ton of decisions that he made here, a lot of things that we go through kind of subconsciously as we paint every model, and I'm getting a little bit overwhelmed. But instead of trying to think about everything at once, I'm just going to start focusing on painting the model with some warm colors. And what better place to start than the face, and I'm going to go with a really deep, rich red as my starting point so I can over-accentuate this warmth from the very beginning. And since there's not a lot of skin actually showing on this model, I can go extra bold here for this decision without worrying that my model will be way too vibrant next to Vince's, which is a legitimate concern if mine is painted like a giant cotton candy mess next to his more subdued tones. It's not going to feel like they're in the same world. His model isn't painted in a super saturated style. In fact, all of the shadows push to very desaturated colors, so I'm going to have to keep that in mind as I work my way forward. The next extremely important factor that I need to have nailed down before I move any further is to really hammer down the directional lighting that Vince chose to use on his model. You'll notice I did a zenithal highlight of white ink over the black primer on my model before I started painting. I connected the model's bases to see exactly where the main light from his figure hit, and I spritzed my model with white so I could keep it consistent all throughout both models. Lighting, specifically consistency in lighting, is really important on any miniature project you're working on. No matter what scene you're trying to create, how the light hits your model should also be reflected on all of the ambience around them, their base, anything they're holding, maybe other figures on the scene. One thing that's going to get you anytime you use a white zenithal undercoat in your painting is you're going to end up covering it with your first coat of paint anyway, so you immediately lose track of where your highlights are supposed to be. Sometimes what I'll do to prevent this is I'll go in with a brighter color or even a deeper shadow color early on before I've covered up all that white spray, so I don't lose those guidelines and understandings of where the brightest brights and darkest darks should be. The good news is the further you get along in a paint job, the less you need to lean on that zenithal as understanding where the light's supposed to be. You just reference the other things you've completed painting as they should have consistency in their light direction and intensity, and you just need to make sure that's consistent across the entire model. To keep my focus on the light direction and not many other of the details, I'm going to focus just on some beige brown armor that I don't want to be a central focus in terms of color anyway on the model. I'm doing this because I haven't made any decisions on the color scheme yet, and instead of staring at the model and hoping a cool color scheme will pop into my head, I'll just keep working and pushing off that decision until inspiration strikes. You'll notice that I use an off yellow as my highlight color for a lot of the surfaces throughout today's paint job, and that's to instill more warmth as we're building our highlights across the model. You know, I had a funny feeling as I was painting the model up to this point that there was something familiar about this figure, and as I was trying to figure out a color scheme, it suddenly dawned on me. This model is totally just an elf version of Thor. That's right, this is elven medieval Thor. I think especially his helmet, that's what feels so familiar. It's that classic Thor helmet, but this time with bigger wing flappies and a Roman mohawk. So let's just lean into that and paint him in a Thor color scheme. But I do need to be careful about where and how much of each of his colors I include. I still want him to be warm in tone overall, so I'll have to use the blues in his color scheme sparingly. So with that in mind, we need to paint these large sections of his armor in those warm tones. So that's why I'm going with a nice warm gold for his shoulder pads, his chest armor, and the angular scale mail bits around the model. You know, it doesn't take a lot of different paint colors to build up a realistic gold. I'm just using 3 here. It's more important that you follow the shapes of whatever you're painting and to create really stark, bold jumps up in brightness on the edges that would catch the most light. And this armor is a great example of what I was talking about at the beginning of the video. I'm more interested in painting larger, interesting shapes and trying to diagnose how light and color would affect them rather than painting a million tiny little details and chains and bojangles all over the models. It's another reason why I've enjoyed painting slightly larger figures. There's more room to work and you have more fun with the paint. These models are 54mm, which may seem like they're super big, but in reality, they're not. Today's video is brought to us by Potential Power Nutrition, a company who has one mission: to make people feel great. And their chocolate shakes are not a weight loss fad. I have been taking them almost every single day for over a year, and I can tell you that they have exponentially made my life better. And it comes down to this: we all struggle to eat a truly balanced diet. I used to take a ton of vitamins and struggled to regularly eat foods that I knew were good for me but tasted awful. The breakfast blend provides total metabolic support, meaning you get all the right things you need in the right quantities. So you meet your nutritional goals without going over and risking negative side effects related to over supplementation. Not only that, but I feel stronger and I recover faster after workouts. I have way more energy during the day than I ever used to. One shake fills me up without needing any snacking between meals. My gastrointestinal issues have completely gone away. My blood sugar levels are the best they've been in my entire life, and I've lost over 25 pounds. And unlike every other protein shake I've had my entire life, these things actually taste good. Every one of us is different, and what works best for us varies from person to person. But I personally recommend Potential Power Nutrition Shakes to all my family and friends because I've seen it improve my life and others that have tried it. Do your health a favor and check out their link below. They're completely transparent with their ingredients and the benefits they provide. And if you like what you see, why don't you give them a try like I did? To give you an idea of the scale, here is the 54mm Dark Elf next to a Primaris Marine. The Primaris Marine goes up to about the shoulders on the elf, and then if we take a look compared to a Primark model, they are the same scale. So what Games Workshop does is says their models are 32 millimeter scale, but they just make them bigger and bigger the more powerful the model is. So you're basically already painting 54 millimeter scale for most of the hero units you're painting. It's really the Goldilocks zone for painting models. For me, at least, it's big enough where I don't have to worry about too many fiddly details and I can appreciate a little bit more open space, but it's not so big like larger scale models or busts that I've got these super big spaces that I don't know what to do with.
Huge tracts of land.
Now's the time where the kid gloves come off and I need to push the warmth and saturation on my model much more than Vince's emo elf. I want everyone to be looking at my model first in this duel, not his. And as every painter knows, there's no better way to do that than to paint some screaming bright red. And you will notice that I'm using a dark desaturated blue, Payne's gray, in the shadows for this. I'm doing this because this is one of Vince's favorite colors. It's also in his Pro Acryl set, blah, blah, blah. And I'm pretty sure he used it in the shadows on his model. Although I didn't actually care to ask him if he did use it because I don't care. I can really push the punch of vibrant reds by going darker in the shadows first. This is a great color to do that. Mixed with my base tone red, it gives me a really beautiful rich purple. Again, I begin by sketching out the brighter and darker areas first following my zenithal. Then I can continue to build up the highlights with bold pyro red with multiple coats to really make those highlights punch without having to move into oranges or pinks for highlight colors. At this point, I realized Vince tried to pull a fast one on me, but don't worry, he's not that smart. We caught it. He's got this interesting bluish green light that's coming from below and from the rear of his model as kind of a rear bounce light. So I guess I'm gonna have to do that bullshit on my model as well. Thanks, Vince. Now the main surface of my model that color's actually going to hit is just the rear of our cloak. So I mix in some white with our Payne's gray and just a touch of our mid-tone red and sketch out the highlight direction from that rear light. This back of the cloak is still red, but it's mostly in shadow, so we mix in that Payne's gray to get a mid-red tone purplish color for all our shadow tones on this rear facing surface. I can do a quick blend of this cloak by just placing down our shadow colors and quickly rinsing my brush, tapping it on my paper towel to get off most of the moisture, and then spreading out that paint into areas where I didn't place the shadow color to begin with. I'm not actually going to paint in the blue-green highlights just yet. There's a quick way we can do that at the end of our paint job. I just wanted to make sure I got the light direction correct before I moved on. Since we're going with the Thor color scheme, I am definitely going to go with the iconic pure silver helmet here. It's really important we do nail the light direction here, as the highlight on this helmet acts as the most single striking visual cue for our main light source. It's also important that we highlight up to a very bright silver here. The brightest points of the entire model should be on this helmet. Not only will this ensure that people look at my model in the duel instead of Vince's, but it also clarifies where on the model they should look first. Now the foundation of painting this steel is with a grayish blue, which is a cold color, but as we get really bright and add in more of our off-white yellow to the highlight mixture, that coolness kind of goes away, and we can work with tints and glazes later to really reinforce the warmth. But the more important thing is that we are framing the warm face with a nice bright helmet. We're also going to use this silver a couple other parts of the model, including his ringmail skirty bits. Now, this is a really interesting example of how some objects we paint both as individual things as well as the greater whole of a shape that they're a part of. And this is done in the same way that we paint hair. Yes, the sculpture is made up of a lot of fine individual hairs, but we're more focused on the overall shape of that head and the shape that the hair creates. So it's important that we almost unfocus our eyes and think about the larger shape, not the individual ones. We get the highlights, the shadows, and the midtones on that larger overall shape established first, and only then do we move in and focus on the individual rings. As I'm painting the individual rings, I have a guide on how bright or how dark to keep them with my highlights. If it's brighter in the first base tone, I can go really bright as that area is catching more direct light. Those areas down in the shadow can get very little highlights because they're not catching much of the ambient light. Up to this point, I haven't painted any of the various trim around the clothing and armor that our Thor elf is wearing, so now's a great time to start putting in a bit of that blue accent color to help break up the brighter and warmer surfaces with the cold one. I'm a big fan of Exile Blue from P3 for this kind of work. It's rich without being too saturated and overpowering. I'll highlight it with gray as well so we don't push the cold too brightly. Just the base coating of all of this trim is probably one of the more satisfying parts of this entire paint job for me, because it's the first time where everything is cleaned up and all the colors receive a nice dark blue picture frame. To finish up our good guy elf, we've got a couple of details to knock out, but they are very important ones. First off is his shiny sword blade, which I painted with basically the same colors as the other silvers on the model. Funny story though, after I had painted the sword blade, I had accidentally knocked the model over onto my desk directly onto his sword blade. Happily though, the resin did what good resin does, and it flexed instead of snapping, which is great. But because of that extreme flexing, the paint that I just applied on that blade chipped off, meaning that I needed to sand it down and repaint the entire thing. But you get to watch the painting of the blade for the first time, which I think turned out better anyway, so. Next, I'm going to go with a warm white for his mohawk. I had thought of adding more color, maybe red streaks here, but I think it might be a little bit too loud and distracting from his face, and honestly I like how it turned out more simplified. And our final step is really to just build on everything we've done thus far, and that is building more warmth in my favorite go-to glaze, and that is Cassandora Yellow. Any of the areas that I've previously highlighted, I thin this stuff way down and I add more warmth with a beautiful orange over all those surfaces to really feel that warm light. And lastly, I bust out an airbrush and put in a little thin down blue-green paint by AK 3rd Gen in there, and I spritz those previously highlighted areas on the back of his cloak to really quickly give us a smooth light source that mimics the light source coming from behind on the bad guy elf. And with that, it's as simple as just combining our bases, and we have one completed elf on elf duel. So I'm curious what you all think. Do these two seem like they match up well, both in their paint job as well as if they would belong together on a battlefield? I personally am really happy when I look at these two fine gentlemen together. I know they have a disagreement going, like sometimes Vince and I do, but in the end, I'm sure they'll work it out. It was such a fun, unique experience and challenge to try to figure out how to paint something based on all these decisions I never even think about in my own painting when they're done by somebody else. I found myself being forced to identify how someone else had made those decisions, and in doing so, I feel like I can be a lot more proactive in my own decision making and things with light and color scheme and even unique approaches from inspiration from other people's work on my regular day-to-day painting. So yeah, at first I was very skeptical about this challenge, but I'm really glad that I went through it, even if I did have to do it with Vince. If you haven't stopped the video to do it yet, please do check out Cult of Paint's Deogard 2 Kickstarter that's going on right now. I've got the link down below. These guys really know how to make good models that are so fun to paint, and I know you'll enjoy them as well. Thanks for hanging out today, and as this video does go live on Black Friday, I wanted to give you a small thank you in appreciation for your support of this channel. I am running a Black Friday sale on the Ninjon merch store. Everything on that site is 20% off with code Black Friday 2024. I'll keep it up for at least a couple of weeks or maybe forever if I forget to take off the coupon. Now don't worry, I will be back before you know it with another new video. Just make sure that sometime between now and then you find time in your day to slay the gray.